Hello, everyone. Thank you for staying up until this point. I do bring a really weird presentation, so I hope that you can enjoy the weirdness because of, I think, three things. One of them is just because of the topic. So this presentation is basically an effort. So it's a process that is ongoing between myself and my co-author, Paloma Opazo. I come from the field of deaf studies. That is a multidisciplinary field that includes also sign language studies. So that is the specific corner that I'm bringing this time of that field. But also my co-author Paloma, she's in the Netherlands now. She could not join. She comes from gesture studies, right? So we are building a proposal. We already sent a proposal that did not get accepted for research, but we are just building additional proposals for that. And we are trying to articulate our different fields. But it's super weird that they are not connected because they have so much overlap going on in terms of embodied communication. How is it that we challenge abstract disembodied notions of what language or communication is? So really weird presentation in terms of topic, but also second point that makes it weird is that since Paloma cannot be here, she kindly recorded herself presenting her slides. So we will be shuttling between myself and here and then Paloma through the videos that I brought. I think the third thing that makes this presentation really weird is that you will have to pay a lot of attention to the way that I use my hands. And after the presentation, for example, later today, you won't be able to stop looking at each other's hands when you're talking. I promise it happens in a conversation with Paloma. This happened the whole time as well. So that was actually beautiful. We noticed the way that we were doing this. So I just changed slightly the title of the presentation because I added new crystallization that we feel is the main contribution that we are making at this point. It is related to other terms, so I will explain that idea later. But basically, we're trying to understand how is it that in this really fluid process of embodied communication, right? What happens when two people face each other, they start communicating? How is it that this fluid process of using our bodies suddenly starts crystallizing? So something starts to endure in the process, something that is created in the moment-to-moment interaction suddenly has a life of its own and it just survives the interaction. So we divided this presentation in three different sections. We start with some theoretical articulations and try to explain some basic concepts of our different fields. We bring two different cases to try to make sense of these ideas and this articulation of frameworks. And finally, we try to explain what we think so far are our contributions. But since this is a work in progress, we really accept any additional suggestions, perhaps questions. There's something that you may feel like needs a bit of additional clarifying. That is totally fine. We are also confused ourselves as part of the process. Since we were talking about this whole idea of accepting the process of not understanding, right, of not making sense, we need to stay in there for a long time before we can actually start making sense of things. So just to make sure that to respect, I'm not sure if we have internet connection here. We can see this should be a video, but if it's not playing, I just brought the video. So don't worry, I can prepare.
Thank you.
Right. I will just use this app, I think. Yeah, so the video has no sound, that's fine solo. This is just to show you what do we mean when we say gestures, right? This is just the area in which Paloma is working is the area of co-speech gestures. So how is it that people use their bodies, but especially how is it that they use their hands as they communicate with other people, what they are talking? I will just continue playing this. Something important about this is that most of the time, this is not a conscious process. We just communicate with our hands. We are not thinking the way in which we do it. But funnily enough, when you start thinking about communication only being a matter of language, you notice how is it that we use our whole bodies to communicate. And actually, even though it's not a conscious process, it is revealing of the way that we think and the ways that we conceptualize. So for example, I noticed this morning, Laia, when you were presenting, each time that you mentioned political economy, you were making a similar gesture. So the first time you did this, political economy. The second time you did political economy, right? really paying attention to everyone's way of using hands, but that was my favorite one because that way of using gesture is really revealing of a conceptualization. So in sign languages, different sign languages, you tend to sign in your upper body space things that are more abstract or systemic, right? So when you were saying political economy, it really shows your comprehension of this being kind of a systemic pressure on individual people. So concrete things are more like at this level, and more abstract things are at this level. So just by looking at your hands, I could see your way of thinking, your way of conceptualizing thinking in a very embodied way. Beautiful. Thank you for that. Um, but what I do in terms of sign languages is that things become a bit different because you also use your whole body, right? Sign languages are not only about the way you use your hands, you use your face, you use your bodily movements, all of that comes together. But in contrast with gestures, in sign languages is much more conscious, voluntary communication. You have to think about how is it that you intend to explain things in different sign languages. I'm a hearing person, but I'm a sign language user myself. I have a level 6 certification on BSL, so that's the highest level that you can get. So I can say some really interesting things about sign languages, not only from a third person perspective, but also from a first person perspective. It really has expanded my way of thinking about communication and languages. I would never, ever, ever, from this point onwards, accept the idea that, for example, languages are disembodied, abstract, just I can continue with that idea, let you know. So let's start with theoretical articulations. And so at this point, I will show the first video that Paloma prepared. So really try to pay attention not only to what she says, but also the way that she uses her hands. And I promise it's super brilliant. I guess we should have good volume. Let's try the video.
All right, so what do we mean with gesture? We're going to use Kendon's description of gesture, which is characterized as a visible action, as utterance. And this is important because utterance is not only considered at the verbal level, but also the actions that we do with our hands. So as Kendon says, this is a label for actions that have the features of manifest deliberate expressiveness. And here I want to highlight the idea of deliberate expressiveness. That doesn't mean that what we're doing it as in a conscious level, but more that our hands have an intention to communicate. So in this sense, what may be gesture in one circumstance may be incidental movement in another. So gesture is grounded in a context. And gesture thus cannot be given a definition that is independent of how the participants in any situation are treating each other's flow of actions. Over here, I've included some examples that are described by Kendon over the use of the open hands and how it can be displayed and produced to negate or for denial, or for example, over here when it's like, no, please don't, for example, look at me, or like, no, absolutely not, and other types of actions, which maybe in different cultures, in different settings, in different contexts, they would not necessarily mean those things and would not be expressive to be considered as gestures. In this sense, there's this idea of what McNeill has characterized as the Kendon's continuum, which talks about the different levels of conventionalization that gestures can have. So the first time that McNeill developed this notion, he talked about gesticulation, the type of idiosyncratic gestures that happen in conversation. He talked about pantomime, which nowadays is not really considered. Also emblems, which are, for example, in Italian, when do like this, something is nice, or in Dutch, you do like this when something is nice. And this kind of Specific gestures, culturally embedded gestures that have a fixed meaning and can be done without resorting to words, and then sign language, which will be discussed later. So gestures can be categorized depending on their levels of conventionalization. And more recently, this continuum has included the notion of recurrent gestures, which are certain gestures that have a pragmatic function, which are fixed in their form, but they're not as emblems. For example, I don't know, if you do like this, like the typical heart in Korea, that's an emblem, but a recurrent gesture would be if you're talking and you go and say like, what is called a cyclic gesture. You're like, oh yeah, and the situation kept going on and on and on and on. So these levels of conventionalization is important to keep in mind to understand the connection between gestures and culture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paloma. So she's the expert in gestures, and so I will continue with sign languages. Something important, something that I should never take for granted is what do we mean by sign languages. I know that you may have heard about this if you come from the areas of disability, so I'm sorry about this, but I will have to repeat some information. So remember, sign languages, as I mentioned, they go beyond just the use of hands, right? You have to use your whole body to communicate at different levels, and you actually express plenty of information simultaneously. So for example, if I try to describe how someone was driving a car, I can use a string of words in English, for example, to describe how someone was driving, but in sign language, everything gets compressed into a single highly inflected sign, which is, for example, if someone was riding quite quickly up and down different hills for a long time, I can just say, and that's it. That's all the information that we have to add just to say the same thing. So that is a madness when it comes to interpretation as well. Like that only, like single sign becomes such a long sentence. Also, sign languages are different from spoken languages. They do not map into spoken languages. They have a different linguistic structure. They have their own culturally accepted ways of saying things. They tend to have in different countries, but they are different in different countries as well. And they tend to have a similar structure in terms of topic comment. So actually, there's some evidence of deaf Chinese people having less of a struggle to make a connection between different varieties of spoken, like different dialects of Chinese, right, with their own sign languages. When you compare that with the structure of our languages, for example, here in English, which tends to be subject, verb, object, for example, as a general structure. But yeah, and also sign languages are not universal. That is quite frustrating for me as well, because like I learned a lot of BSL here in Britain, and then I have to go back to Chile and basically relearn my Chilean sign language. It will have to be that way. There is an international sign language that is more of a fluid practice. So it's something that emerges when, for example, deaf people from different countries meet with one another, they start to negotiate, what do you mean by this and by that, and suddenly you have this international sign language. There is some level of conventionalization of that international sign language, but actually it tends to be highly dominated by ASL, so American Sign Language. There's something about the United States, deaf people in there kind of are overtaken, and that level of influence is going everywhere. Right. So one of the things that I should have mentioned from the beginning is that one of the main reasons why we're trying to do this articulation with Paloma is that we are trying to think through the concepts of Vygotsky and activity theory to see how is it that we can start from these processes of understanding embodied communication, but in a way that has stronger connection with different cultures. So, for example, how is it that through learning a language, your body is becoming socialized in a specific way, or how is it that there is a persistence of specific gestures in different countries or cultures that have been going on even like for centuries, or how come is it that we can understand this process in a way that is non-binary, right? It's not about the body being biological and isolated. It's about the body in a context, in a culture, right? That allows this process to happen. So we bring two cases of crystallization. One of them, the one that I bring, is from the creation of Nicaraguan Sign Language. So that was basically a natural experiment that went in Nicaragua. So deaf people in Nicaragua, in that country, did not have a sign language. And over two cohorts, they created their own sign language. So imagine that kind of happened kind of recently. So imagine being able to see how a whole culture creates a language, quotation marks, out of nothing. Beautiful opportunity. To understand how that came to happen, I need to explain briefly what do we mean by home signs, right? So home signs are gestural systems that are created by deaf children who have no exposure to any other language with their families to make sure that they can communicate within their houses, right? So that means that home signs are highly specific to each house. Another person coming from outside may not be able to fully make sense of what is going on with home signs in that sense. But even though they are really unique to each specific context, there are people studying home signs and they have found out that home signs are really systematic. That means that over time, because of repeated routines in the house, because of the presence of objects in the same places, and because of repeated interactions with people, you can start observing that home signs, even though they're quite messy, they have an internal organization. So they have ways of gestural representing, for example, lexical-like components or morphological-like components. So they, even though they may make no sense to someone from the outside, they behave as if they were some kind of language. So there's something about, even though they are improvised, they tend to take this language-like character. So people are really interested in understanding home signs as precursors or previous development to fully developed sign languages. And that's why people who are trying to understand how come a sign language was created in Nicaragua when there was no previous sign language, they started to pay attention to communication within homes and what was going on with home signs. Now, I made sure, because I wanted to make the connection with activity theory and with Vygotsky and the Leuven analysis of this. It was a bit frustrating. I tend to enjoy a lot what Andy Leuven, so Vygotsky really committed to his own version of activity theory. He says some fascinating things in general about, for example, languages and activity theory, but let's see if I can say this in a really coherent way. He was not convinced that home signs were a good explanation of the development of a language. Why? Being a Vygotskian, or according to his interpretation of what it means to be a good Vygotskian, it's always important to remember that when you develop a language, with each child develops a language, they usually do it because they have interaction with adult people around them, right? So the adult person includes the higher idea form that is already shaping the language development of the child. So Vygotsky talks about this in The Problem of the Environment. I think that's 1934, something like that. 2 minutes. Oh, wow. Okay. So the thing is that he's not convinced that the whole language can be developed without this ideal form guiding development. So he says there's no way this happened in this way. Home signs cannot be the explanation. There must be a social movement of deaf people trying to create the language. So he gathered evidence of actually some groups of deaf people trying to organize themselves and learn sign languages from different countries and try to expand and increase the systematicity of communication. So according to Andy Leuven, that is the main explanation of why is it that we had a Nicaraguan sign language, because there was a social movement of deaf people trying to create the language, but actually there's evidence that contradicts this in the case of Nicaraguan sign language. Basically because I will be able to explain this, I guess, afterwards, but there were levels of higher systematicity in sign languages in the second cohort that were not present in the use of sign languages in the first cohort. So basically, there is no way that this process was wholly guided by the first cohort who were learning sign languages from other countries. There was a really relevant input from the second cohort And that basically tells you that there is a great input of just that person-to-person, moment-to-moment interaction. Not everything is about the higher form guiding development. There is a component of that, but not totally. I can explain more later about these grammar devices that get more complex in the second cohort. Now, this would be a good moment for showing, again, like a brief Paloma's explanation. Perhaps I can try to close with that. Okay, let's see.
When it comes to emerging conventions, we consider that there are conventions that can be developed in different communities of practice. So, for example, in this case, we have a type of gesture that appears in an architecture classroom where the teacher is describing a model and he has a model, an architecture model in front of him. But first he's touching and manipulating the model, and afterwards he starts describing this model without necessarily referring to it or touching it. So the instrument is no longer needed, as the gesture represents and kind of imagines this model and its characteristics. So these gestures do not represent actions or instrument, but features of the object. And we see in the upper image that when the teacher is referring to the cardboard model, he uses this hand without touching the model to describe a long bent shape. Yeah. So after a few times and after throughout the classroom, he does this gesture in multiple occasions. And then when the students are describing the models, the model in front of them, they also resort to this gesture that for the rest is kind of like a shared understanding about the shape and the features of this very concrete thing. So according to Levarón and Strake, shared understanding is especially evident when students participate in the class discussion and also perform long bent gestures to articulate their views, which build upon group understanding. And these gestures are very situated and maybe they're not conventionalized as other gestures, but they are understood and shared in this specific classroom where this gesture is performed. This is why we like the idea of levels of crystallization, because first we think that crystallization is a good image that expresses the tension between something flexible and something that crystallizes. And we can say that there are various levels of crystallization in communities of practice. It's very different, the previous example that we gave about the architecture professor talking about the shapes of the model, than a do-it-yourself workshop where an instructor is hands-on manipulating the material world and, as the image shows, a specific instrument. In the second case, the one that we already discussed, the gesture is abstract and already shared by others. But what happened with another level of crystallization when these gestures become more conventionalized? Although we know that conventionalization is a tricky word, but let's say shared by others outside of that specific classroom. I don't know, with open hand gestures that are used by lawyers when they do opening statements, this type of very large gestures performed by them, or hand gestures that are used by medical professionals to represent an area of the body where they do like anatomical mappings.
So I know I'm out of time, so I will just skip to the slide that shows visually representing our main contributions. So if someone wants me to explain it, I can do it. But yeah, I'm assuming I'm out of time. Yeah.
And he's probably got about minutes.
Okay, so perhaps I can do it just briefly. We try to understand how I said that in this process of this creation of gestures, or for example, that eventually may become signs, or they have like greater conventionalization, you can see traces of interactions with the material world, right? So that is a process in which gestures and sign language in general, I can give you a few more examples of that later, make this continuous recruitment of actions in the material world. So that means that moment-to-moment interactions on microgenetic level, according to the Gotskin analysis, has a contribution. But on the other side, on the other hand, because these actions happens in interaction with other people, we are constantly acquiring the other person's way of communicating as well. So our gestures, our ways of moving are also continuously being socialized. There's also this contribution on the social genetic level. So basically, it's a two-sided interaction. You could say a dialectical interaction going on in terms of thinking about socialization of the body or embodiment of socialization as well in a way that is non-binary or dialectical. Yes. Okay. Thanks.